Hi guys, it's Kirsty. In today's video, I am going to talk about the numbness that we can experience when we're suffering from OCD. So I want to talk a little bit about why we may find ourselves feeling like this quite often. Maybe some compulsions that may be associated with this feeling of numbness that may start to enhance that numb feeling even further and obviously keep us locked on. And I also then want to offer some tips in regards to dealing with this numbness. But before I go into that, I would like to ask, as always, please do subscribe by clicking on the subscribe button below so that you can stay up to date with new videos as they're released. So there's quite often certain feelings that are talked about most often with OCD, perhaps the biggest one being anxiety. So one of the biggest feelings that we experience with OCD is anxiety, which is associated with fear, because essentially what OCD is kind of us being locked onto in a fear cycle. So we might also talk about experiencing other emotions in addition to anxiety, such as feeling low mood or feeling anger or irritation or exhausted. But one that isn't maybe talked about quite as much is a feeling of numbness that can occur at certain points in our OCD suffering and even on our kind of recovery journey. So that's why I wanted to talk about this, because in certain videos myself and other people on this channel have, you know, touched upon numbness maybe as a symptom that comes along when we're working on our recovery, depending on what the theme is. But I think it's useful to have a video kind of talking around it and giving some examples of where we might feel this numbness. So firstly, I want to talk about why the kind of numbness might come about. So when we're suffering from anxiety or OCD, we're doing a lot of mental work. We're doing a lot of trying to work out how we can stop feeling so uncomfortable. Obviously, as I've mentioned, there's anxiety being produced. Our minds are working in overtime. So it can be very tiring for us, for our bodies and our minds. And if we're doing this over long periods of time, it can kind of end up leaving us feeling almost a bit of nothingness, because to be able to feel something, almost it kind of sometimes relies on having some energy left. And when we've been working our minds over time and our nervous system is frayed because we're locked onto this fear cycle, we're anxious, our cortisol levels are higher, we're desperately trying to work it out, our minds are going at 100 miles per hour, maybe we're doing physical compulsions and all of that, it can leave us feeling kind of mentally and emotionally depleted, hence the kind of numb feelings. So then we could find ourselves thinking, why don't I feel empathy for that person when they're talking about this, difficult situation they're feeling? Or why don't I feel sadness when I think about someone who I love that's passed away? Why can't I feel, love for them when I think about them? Why can't I feel love for my children right now? Why can't I feel love for my partner, for my parents, my friends, my siblings? Why aren't I excited to see my friend who I haven't seen in ages? Why aren't I even excited to order this Chinese takeaway, which I absolutely used to love, and it used to be the highlight of my Saturday? Not saying that's me or anything, but just giving examples. Why does this hobby that I used to adore, why does this not make me feel excited and enthusiastic anymore? Or it might be even working further on, like if you're further on in your recovery and your anxiety starts to dip, why aren't I feeling anxious anymore? What does that mean? And then you might look at these kind of things that, you're not feeling like you think you should feel in the moment, And then it might start to pose more questions that you ask yourself. Why aren't I feeling the way I think that I should feel? And then you start maybe analysing that and then testing yourself. So maybe this is where some compulsions might come into play in regards to the numbness that you might be feeling. For example, if you're someone who has been suffering from relationship OCD, obviously you've been maybe asking yourself the question over and over, should I be in a relationship? Does it feel right? Should I be with my partner? Do I love them? Do I feel the right way around them? And if you're repeatedly testing yourself for your feelings, you might find that you come up with nothing, because, as has been used as an analogy many times on this channel, because it's an excellent analogy, you can't tickle yourself. If you kind of go to, tickle yourself, it doesn't make you jump or anything. There's no reaction. So if you're digging deep and testing yourself for, certain emotion that you feel like you should be feeling, you'll probably come up feeling not how you think you should feel, and even potentially numb. So in regards to relationship OCD, you might play scenarios over and over in your head to see how you feel about it, like, imagining being with your partner in certain scenarios, and it might leave you feeling numb, and it ends up feeding the cycle, because that numbness triggers you further, and then you're like kind of trying to feel feelings that you think you should be. Or it might be, the same could apply for, with your, like I say, with your children, for example. You might be thinking, having a fear of being a bad parent, and then you can't muster these feelings that you think you should be feeling towards your children. And then you're looking for them, and you're testing yourself. And maybe you're even Googling it, saying, why don't I feel anything? And all of these actions are then saying to your brain, yeah, this is really, really bad. This is awful. This is terrifying. This is really, really bad. We have to keep an eye on this because this is really bad. So then you're then hyper aware of the numbness. So it's not even like you were looking for, like, how it might have started, that you were looking for another emotion and you were sort of testing yourself for it. It might then be that you're just hyper aware then of the numbness. And as I mentioned, and this is related to backdoor spike, and there's a couple of videos on this channel about that. So if you're working in your recovery for a while and your anxiety goes down, which is a good thing, your OCD might use that against you. And then you think, I don't feel anxiety anymore. That must mean my fear is real and it's going to happen, and that's terrible. And then and then it's kind of, you're looking for the anxiety, then you come up with numbness again. So again, then you become hyper aware of that numbness. And then there's also then what else does the numbness mean about me? So I mentioned an example of, maybe a lack of being able to feel empathetic towards people when you feel stories, when you hear sad stories, and then you start to think, I don't feel empathy. And then you think, oh God, I don't feel sad for that person. And then maybe you Google that, and then you Google it, and then you come up with the word sociopath. And you're like, what's a sociopath? Oh my God, am I a sociopath? Because I'm not feeling empathy, because I'm feeling numb when I hear this story, when I really should be feeling awful for that person. So then maybe you start to latch on to that, for example. So you can see how that feeling of numbness would originally come about, and then how it can end up sticking around when we test ourselves for it, but also then how it can end up triggering kind of other ideas that we might latch onto because of the numbness. And of course, the more we do this, the more we're kind of encouraging these feelings that we're trying to push away. So this is how you kind of end up being locked on that cycle, when you're actually scared of the lack of feelings that you're feeling. And the same applies for, like I said about not being, lack of maybe feeling excited to see your friends, or excited about your hobbies, or, foods that you really like, or, music that you used to enjoy. And then you start to kind of look into that, and then maybe you see the word depression or something. You start to read about how, maybe a loss of interest in the things that you enjoy might mean depression or something like that. So it could then trigger obsessing over, oh my God, am I depressed as well as having OCD and anxiety? Is this clinical depression? And so thus the cycle continues, and it might trigger you to worry about having some other mental health condition, whether that's sociopathy, or if that's the right word, being a sociopath, or suffering from depression perhaps. So it can then trigger obsessions of its very own, the obsession with feeling numb. That numbness can make you feel like you don't care about things that you used to care about. You know, it can make you almost feel like you don't care about your relationship. You don't care about your children, your parents, your friends, your family. It can make you feel like you don't care about your job. And of course, the more you test yourself thinking, no, I must do. Let's dig in. Let's try and find them emotions. Let's analyze that scenario and let's remember how I felt in that situation. And let's analyze that, because there must have been a feeling there that I'm missing here. I need to work it out. And I need to work out, you know, if I really am feeling numb, what that means about me. And then I need to find out, you know, I need to do something about what, you know, about that scenario. And then it keeps it going. So you can see, again, this is kind of how we end up almost feeling a bit obsessed perhaps with that feeling of numbness, and that feeling of numbness becomes the thing that we fear. So what we want to do is bring down our fear of that feeling of numbness. So the first thing that I suggest in regards to this is knowing why you might feel numb. Of course, there's no certainty surrounding everything, so I use the word might be feeling numb, because we never want to say it's 100% this, because then, you know, there's very few things in life that are certain. So you know, obviously, maybe if you've watched this video, you hear my take on this. There's also a couple of books recommended on the OCD recovery reading list, which are there to kind of educate about anxiety and how it can leave you feeling a certain way, and explaining it with the view that knowledge is power. So if we understand something a bit better, we can kind of expect it a bit more and maybe fear it a bit less, to see that it's something that we've created by, you know, over analysing and working too hard mentally over long periods of time. And by stop trying to work it out and running away from it and resisting it, we can help ourselves, we'll become, you know, less kind of obsessed with that feeling, and gradually over time it won't bother us as much, and eventually, you know, it would hopefully go. But so these two books are Paul Davies' At Last Alive and Claire Weekes' Self-Help for Your Nerves. So two very different authors from different time periods and two very different writing styles, but both of them were talking from own experience. Claire Weekes was also a trained psychologist, I do believe, as well, a therapist, but she had suffered from panic attacks and anxiety. Paul Davies had been an anxiety sufferer, experiencing panic attacks, depersonalization, you know, the various things that come along when you're suffering from anxiety. But they both talk about in their books various aspects of anxiety, and they both talk about the feeling of numbness in certain chapters. So I recommend those books to educate yourself in terms of the feelings that come along with anxiety, because knowledge is power, as I said, and that can help us feel less afraid. And as I said, the less afraid we are, the less resistance we feel we need to put up, and the less maybe we believe I shouldn't be feeling this way. The next thing that personally I have found that's really helped me with the feeling of numbness is not making strict rules for myself about how I should feel in a certain situation. So this is when you can look at your irrational beliefs surrounding the feelings that you may have, you know, saying I should feel this way, I must feel this way, otherwise it's awful. So because by doing that, well, firstly, these things that we're saying, you should feel a certain way. Well, who says that? Society, you know, is this something, again, that you know, society's made up, that you should feel maybe ecstatic when you're, you know, when you get engaged, you should feel like blissfully walking on air, or you should look at your pet children and always feel overwhelming feelings of love at all times. So I recommend looking at where you're saying, okay, what's so wrong with not feeling how you're expecting to feel in that scenario? And then you might be, well, I should feel this way because it's terrible if not. And then you can start working backwards to find the irrational belief. And it would probably be, I should feel this way, and if I don't feel this way, it'd be terrible. This scenario would be terrible. So then you want to start disputing that. So, and there's various other videos about disputing that you can go into for more kind of advice on how to go about disputing and identifying fears. But that would be the piece of advice that I give here, is looking at the irrational beliefs. And I'm going to talk about one, and just briefly mention one of the books on the reading list. It's the Albert Ellis book, which is the first book on the reading list. It's kind of the biggest one that talks about, irrational beliefs and how they fuel our emotional suffering. So this book, Stubbornly Refuse to Make Yourself Miserable About Anything, Yes, Anything, by Albert Ellis, is a great one for kind of looking at the things that you might not be happy with and, that you're emotionally suffering from, and starting to break down, giving you guidance about identifying where you're saying you should be this way or you must feel this way. And then you can start breaking it down, why must you? And looking at changing that to more rational belief, a preference to feel a certain way rather than a need or a demand to feel a certain way. And then the next thing that I want to talk about is labeling yourself as well. Basically, this is kind of an all or nothing thinking problem. And it's saying, if I don't feel a certain way, then that means this about me. And then if that means something about you that scares you, that you're fearful of, it could mean that you're essentially writing yourself off as a person if this thing is true. So, for example, you might think, well, I don't feel this, I feel numb at this point, I don't feel like this, and I feel like I should. Therefore, I am a sociopath. And if I am a sociopath, then I'm awful and I'm just worthless as a person. And the thing is then that you want to be trying to view that in a more balanced way, considering the fact that a sociopath hasn't actually asked to be a sociopath. Obviously, I'm not an expert on sociopaths, so I won't go into this in too much detail. I'm just giving an example of something that I latched onto when I was feeling numb, in my kind of ignorance, I suppose. I was, generalizing, taking one word and running with it without knowing all the facts. But, if you really look at it like that, you don't have to, you could think, well, I didn't, even if that was the case, I didn't necessarily ask to be that way. And it's kind of going towards that unconditional self-acceptance piece in terms of, whatever it means about you, if you are feeling numb in certain situations, maybe you can draw a bit of compassion towards yourself. And just go with the fact that, we all have to play the hand that we've been dealt in life, whatever that means, whatever, and that includes with whatever brain we have. Obviously, we have a preference to kind of do our best to kind of be the kind of person we'd like to be. But again, it's helpful if that is a preference rather than an absolute black and white demand or need. And then the last thing that I just wanted to mention is that just because you feel a certain way, or in this case, you don't feel a certain way, it doesn't mean that you have to act in line with that. So, for example, if you are being told by a good friend about something that they're struggling with, they're finding difficult, and you're feeling numb towards it, struggling to muster feelings of caring, it doesn't mean that you can't still comfort your friend and act in a caring way if that's something you'd like to do. You don't have to run away from that situation. You can still kind of act in a way that you'd like to. Whilst if you know the reasons why you might be feeling numb, you don't have to analyze it, and you can just maybe, if you want to, you don't have to look for feelings of feeling of empathy or feeling of compassion in order to act in a compassionate or empathetic way. Same applies for, feelings of love towards whether it's your partner or your children or your friends. Just because you don't feel very loving, it doesn't mean that you can't act in a loving way if that's the way that you'd like to act. So what I'm saying is that it doesn't have to dictate the way that you behave, just because, what we say about anxiety, it doesn't have to dictate how you live your life. It doesn't have to stop you going out. It's just accepting that feeling of discomfort and knowing that while you're doing the things that you want to feel, regardless of how uncomfortable you feel, you're doing good, because you're showing your mind that these obsessions, these kind of bothering you with all these feelings and all of that, you're not pushing it away, so it's irrelevant. You'll do what you want to do regardless of all of that and the thoughts that come up. And the same applies for this feeling of numbness. Do what you want to do regardless of the feeling of numbness. The less you stop checking for it, and the less the less you're checking to feel a certain way that you feel like you should be doing, the less you're going to be noticing that feeling of numbness, or noticing the lack of the feelings that you think you should be feeling. And over time, you might start to notice feelings coming back, or maybe you won't even notice, because you won't need to feel a certain way, because it doesn't feel quite so life or death for you, because you've worked on reducing your fear around these feelings or lack of feelings and what they might mean. So I hope this video has been helpful in terms of talking about, firstly, why the numbness might come about in the first place. Secondly, how it kind of ends up becoming a problem to us, and some kind of compulsions surrounding this. So mostly I'd say maybe mental checking compulsions, checking how you're feeling and things like that, running scenarios over in your mind and analysing. And then I've given some tips in terms of how you can approach this to help you. So I hope it's been helpful. Thank you ever so much for watching, and do take care. Bye.